3 years after she vanished without a trace, the millionaire CEO falls to his knees the moment he sees her, because she didn't come back alone. The moment Ethan Black shouted those words, the entire top floor of the skyscraper seemed to freeze. His voice, usually controlled and polished from years of boardrooms and negotiations, cracked with something raw and jagged. "I'm sick of you," echoed against the glass walls, bouncing back at him as if mocking his attempt to contain the storm inside. He wasn't yelling out of anger, he barely knew how to be angry at her. It was the shock, the disbelief, the bruised ache of 3 lost years erupting all at once. He hadn't seen Mia Brown since the day she vanished without a note, without a warning, without even the decency of a final argument. 3 years of empty mornings, sleepless nights, hollow victories, and a phone that never lit up with her name. 3 years he had climbed success after success but felt more and more like a ghost walking through his own life. No amount of money, no deal, no recognition filled the space she left. Now she stood in front of him as if the universe had suddenly decided to give back what it stole. Her dark hair, once shiny and soft under his fingers, was pulled into a messy bun that looked like she tied it while running. Her red tank top seemed too thin for the cold October wind that still clung to her. Her eyes, brown, tired, unreadable, held oceans of things she hadn't said. She looked both familiar and impossibly changed, like someone who lived a lifetime he had never witnessed. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his throat. His legs moved without permission, buckling as if they were no longer strong enough to hold the weight of everything he felt. One moment he was staring at her, trying to understand if she was real or some vivid hallucination brought on by longing. The next he was on his knees on the polished marble floor, the same floor where investors and celebrities had walked with perfect confidence. But he didn't care. Pride had no place in this moment. Mia flinched when he fell, as if she feared what might come next. Her hands instinctively tightened around the straps of a worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked like someone who had arrived here not because she wanted to, but because she had run out of places to go. He tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. He wanted to ask where she had been, why she left, why she didn't trust him enough to stay. He wanted to demand answers, to beg for them, to shake her and pull her close at the same time. But all he managed was a shaky breath that trembled like a broken apology. And then he saw them, 2 small shapes hiding behind her legs. At first he thought they were someone else's children, maybe kids she was babysitting or helping. But when one of the boys dared to peek out, Ethan's entire world shifted in a single heartbeat. The boy's eyes, blue, impossibly blue, were a mirror of his own. His mind went blank. 3 years of confusion suddenly sharpened into something terrifyingly clear. Mia lowered her gaze as if she knew exactly what he had realized. Her shoulders dropped, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked like she might cry. Ethan wasn't sure how long he stayed on the floor, staring up at her and the children who looked so much like him it hurt. He wanted to reach for them, but fear rooted him to the spot. Fear that if he moved too fast, they would disappear again. Fear that this moment was too fragile to breathe on. The office was silent except for the faint buzz of city traffic far below. 3 years compressed into one impossible moment, pressing down on him until he felt he might shatter. He opened his mouth, forcing out a single question he wasn't sure he was ready to hear the answer to. "Mia, why?" But she only pressed her lips together, as if the truth was too heavy to release just yet. And for the first time in Ethan Black's life, he realized he wasn't in control of anything, not his company, not his future, and certainly not the fate that had just walked back into his life with 2 blue-eyed boys hiding behind her. For 3 long years, Mia's disappearance had lived inside Ethan like an open wound that refused to close. In the beginning he hadn't believed she was truly gone, he thought she was angry, overwhelmed, maybe taking space. He waited for a message that never came, replaying their last conversation over and over, trying to find the moment where everything had gone wrong. The first days passed in disbelief, the first weeks in fear, and the first months in a quiet, gnawing panic that seeped into every corner of his life. He hired private investigators, hacked through digital traces, visited every place she had ever mentioned. But Mia Brown was nowhere. It was as if she had slipped into a parallel world where he had no way to reach her. Ethan had built empires and solved crises that brought entire corporations to their knees, yet he couldn't understand why the woman he loved vanished without a trace. His mind cycled through explanations. Maybe he'd pressured her with his demanding lifestyle, maybe she'd found someone more stable, maybe she realized she didn't want the billionaire chaos around him. But none of those ideas felt right, and yet they were all he had. Each night he came home to a penthouse that felt too big, too silent, too perfectly designed to highlight the absence of her laugh echoing down the hallway. He would sit on the edge of his bed staring at her side, still untouched, still cold. As time dragged on, the people around him changed the way they looked at him. His board members noticed the distraction in his eyes, the exhaustion he hid behind crisp suits and calculated decisions. His friends tried to pull him into social events, encouraging him to move on, but it always ended with him quietly slipping out early because the world felt too loud without her. Even his own reflection started to feel unfamiliar. He had always been sharp, confident, the kind of man who knew exactly what he wanted. But now there was something fractured in his gaze, a faint heaviness that 3 years could not erase. Meanwhile, Mia's absence became a strange kind of presence. He noticed her in the most random details: the smell of cinnamon in a cafe, the faded red color of a stranger's shirt, the way a woman tucked her hair behind her ear. Every small reminder stabbed at him unexpectedly, forcing him to remember that she had once done those things in front of him, effortlessly, without knowing she was carving herself into his memory. His heart learned to ache in silence, during meetings, during long flights, during moments when the world expected him to be flawless. But the world never stopped moving for his grief. In her absence, his business grew even larger, expanding across states and industries. People praised him for his relentless drive, unaware that the drive came from an emptiness he was terrified to confront. He drowned himself in work, hoping that numbers, contracts, and achievements might fill the place she once occupied. They never did. Late at night, when New York's lights dimmed and the city finally quieted, Ethan would sit alone in his office staring at a project he had no strength left to finish. Those were the moments when the weight of losing her felt unbearable, pressing on his chest until breathing became a conscious effort. He never told anyone about the dreams. The ones where he saw Mia in blurred hallways or crowded train stations, where he almost reached her but woke up before she turned around. Sometimes in those dreams she was calling his name, and sometimes she was just walking away into a fog he couldn't navigate. Every morning he woke with his heart racing and a bitter taste in his mouth, and every morning he convinced himself to get up, straighten his tie, and pretend that his world hadn't collapsed. And through all those years he never once imagined the truth, that while he sat in his corner office drowning in unanswered questions, Mia was hiding, surviving, protecting something he didn't even know existed. The boys were already learning to walk at the time he still searched the city for her silhouette. He had missed their first steps, their first laughs, their first words. He didn't know their names or that they shared his eyes, his expressions, his stubbornness. He had spent 3 years building a future he thought he'd live alone, unaware that his real future was growing up without him, waiting for a day neither of them knew how to reach. So when she walked back into his life after all that time, thinner, shaken, protective, with 2 children clutching at her legs, it didn't just shock him. It shattered everything he thought he understood about the past. Those 3 years of silence, confusion, and grief suddenly felt different, heavier, sharper. Every unanswered question multiplied, every memory twisted into something new. Mia had been living a life he knew nothing about, carrying responsibilities he should have shared with her, fighting fears he hadn't even known existed. He looked at her in that moment, 3 years of longing and heartbreak swirling behind his eyes, and he realized that whatever story she had lived during those years was far darker than he had ever imagined. And as much as he had suffered in her absence, the fear in her gaze told him she had suffered even more. For a few seconds, Ethan couldn't understand what he was looking at. His mind refused to connect the impossible dots. The two small boys clinging to Mia's legs seemed frightened, their tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her jeans as if she were the only safe place in the world. They couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with soft, slightly curled dark hair and round cheeks still carrying the innocence of early childhood. At first glance, they could have been anyone's children, strangers, relatives, even kids she had agreed to watch for someone in a moment of desperation. But then one of them, the braver of the two, lifted his chin just enough to peek at the tall man kneeling on the polished marble. The moment their eyes met, Ethan felt something inside him snap in a way he had never experienced. The boy's eyes were an arresting, unmistakable blue, the exact shade that had stared back at Ethan in the mirror every morning of his life. Not similar. Not close. Identical. It was like looking into a much smaller, softer version of himself. His breath left him all at once, and a strange dizziness took over, as if gravity had shifted under his feet. The boy blinked at him, a mixture of curiosity and caution flickering in his expression, and then he quickly hid his face again behind Mia's leg. Ethan's gaze drifted to the second boy, who stood slightly behind the first. His hair was the same deep brown, the same unruly wave, and though he tried to avoid eye contact, Ethan caught the briefest flash of blue when the child shifted. 2 boys. 2 sets of blue eyes he instantly recognized as his own. 2 lives that had existed for years without him even knowing they were part of this world. His heartbeat thundered painfully in his chest. Mia swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening. She didn't have to say anything, he already knew. But understanding something and accepting it were 2 very different battles. He felt unsteady, as if the entire structure of his life had been yanked upward and turned upside down. His hands, still bracing him on the floor, curled slightly against the cold marble. He wanted to reach out to them, to touch their hair, to hear their little voices, to feel something real that grounded him in this strange new reality. Yet he remained frozen, terrified that any sudden movement might scare them or, worse, make Mia pull them away. The boys peeked at him again, one after the other, their eyes mirroring a mixture of fear and curiosity. They looked so alike that anyone would assume they were twins, though there were subtle differences. One stood a little straighter, the other held tighter to Mia, one seemed more adventurous, the other more cautious. Ethan took in every detail as if his life depended on memorizing them. Their matching blue t-shirts were slightly wrinkled, suggesting a hurried morning. Their shoes were scuffed, but clean. Their hair had the soft, airy look of children who had been running or playing recently. They were healthy. Real. His. Mia finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, trembling, almost apologetic. Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you. The words drifted into the air like something fragile, something she feared he might crush. His stomach twisted. He could hear his pulse in his ears. How old are they? He asked, though the answer was painfully obvious. But he needed to hear it. He needed to force this moment into clarity. She hesitated, then brushed a hand over the head of the boy nearest to her. 3. The world blurred for a second. Exactly the amount of time she had been gone. Exactly the number of years he had spent convincing himself she left because she stopped loving him. She hadn't just been protecting herself. She had been protecting them, from something he still didn't understand. The realization struck him with brutal force, he had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their first birthdays. He hadn't held them when they cried, hadn't kissed their scraped knees, hadn't been there to watch them learn how to laugh. These were pieces of fatherhood he could never get back, no matter how much power or money he had. The weight of that loss buried him under a wave of guilt so heavy he felt physically ill. Mia seemed to sense the storm inside him. She knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to the boys, her arms protectively curving around their small shoulders. Her movements weren't defensive as much as instinctive, like a mother shielding her children from a danger she wasn't sure was real or imagined. Ethan didn't miss that. It hurt more than he expected. One of the boys tugged on her tank top, whispering something too soft for Ethan to catch. Mia gently stroked his hair, murmuring reassurance. It was the kind of tender gesture Ethan had once imagined witnessing as he stood behind her in a warm kitchen on a quiet morning. Instead, he saw it from a distance, feeling like an intruder in a life he should have been part of from the beginning. He forced himself to find his voice again, though it felt as if speaking might tear open a deeper wound. "What are their names?" This time, she looked him directly in the eyes. There was fear there, but also something else: regret, sorrow, exhaustion, and a flicker of the love they once shared. Aiden and Lucas. The names settled inside him like a new heartbeat, unfamiliar but immediately precious. He repeated them silently, committing them to memory as if he feared he might forget. Aiden. Lucas. His sons. The emotions inside Ethan collided too quickly: shock, grief, devotion, anger, awe, heartbreak. His throat tightened painfully, and he pressed his hand to the floor just to keep from falling apart again. Everything he had believed for 3 years suddenly seemed small and irrelevant. The real story, the real reason she left, was standing right in front of him with tiny hands and blue eyes and innocent trust. And in that moment, surrounded by silence except for the soft breathing of 2 children who had no idea how drastically they had changed his life, Ethan understood one thing with absolute clarity: nothing would ever be the same again. The office felt strangely smaller once the initial shock began to settle, as if the walls had quietly pressed inward to force the truth into the open. Ethan slowly pushed himself up from the floor, not fully standing but rising enough to look at Mia without craning his neck. His heart was still beating too fast, his hands trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fear, but he forced himself to meet her eyes. He needed answers, needed to understand how his entire life had been rerouted without his knowledge. Mia looked exhausted, as if the confession she was about to deliver had been living in her chest for 3 relentless years. She gently guided the boys to sit on the small sofa near the window, giving them a handful of toy cars from her backpack to keep them occupied. They obeyed immediately and quietly, their heads bent over the toys, unaware of the emotional battlefield unfolding just a few feet away. Once the boys were settled, Mia straightened her back, though her posture still carried a hint of the fear she had been carrying for years. Ethan could see the hesitation in her hands, the way her fingers twisted together, the way she kept glancing toward the children as if reassuring herself that they were still safe. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded as though every word had been sharpened by pain. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she began, and Ethan felt something ache in his chest, a small wound reopening. "I left because staying would have put all of us in danger." Ethan frowned, confusion flickering across his face. Danger? From what? His first thought was that she must have been exaggerating or misinterpreting something. But then he remembered the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she protected the boys with her body, and the years she spent making sure no one found them. This wasn't exaggeration. This was survival. She took a slow breath, her eyes briefly closing as though she had to force the next part out. "It was your brother, Ethan." "Daniel." The name landed heavily in the air. Ethan's expression darkened, but not because he understood. It was because he didn't. He shook his head, unable to reconcile her words with the man he had grown up with. Daniel? Why would he? Mia cut him off gently, but firmly, like someone who no longer had the strength to ease the truth. Because he wanted your company. Because he wanted everything you had. And he knew he couldn't control you unless he controlled the things you cared about. She swallowed, her throat tight. Including me. A wave of disbelief washed over Ethan, followed by an anger so sharp it felt like a physical slice across his ribs. Daniel had always been ambitious, competitive, impatient to rise faster than life allowed. But for him to threaten Mia? To force her to run? It was unthinkable. Ethan's jaw clenched as he replayed countless moments in his mind, times Daniel had been unusually distant, suspiciously busy, times he had insisted on handling certain contracts or meeting with certain board members alone. There had been signs, but Ethan had dismissed them as harmless conflicts between brothers. Never once had he imagined the malice that now stood exposed. Mia went on, her voice steadier now that the worst had been said. He approached me the week before I left. I was already pregnant, though I hadn't told you yet. I wanted to wait until the right moment, but the moment never came. He cornered me outside your building and told me he knew. Told me that if I stayed with you, he would ruin your life in ways you couldn't recover from. He said he would make sure you lost everything, your company, your reputation, and that he'd make sure the boys would never have a peaceful life. Her voice cracked, just slightly, as she glanced toward Aiden and Lucas. I believed him, Ethan. He wasn't bluffing. He had documents, emails, proof that he had already started setting things in motion. I panicked. And when he told me that leaving was the only way to keep you safe, I didn't see another option. Ethan felt a deep, hollow pain settle in his stomach, as if someone had carved out a part of him and left it empty. He had spent years resenting her for abandoning him, imagining betrayal or indifference, when the truth was something far more devastating. She had been protecting him, protecting their children, while he had been drowning in self-blame and confusion. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly as he tried to absorb everything she had said. The thought of Daniel threatening her, manipulating her, leveraging her love for him to force her into hiding made Ethan's blood boil. He turned to her, his voice lower but laced with a tremor he couldn't disguise. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me what he said? I would have protected you. I would have protected them. Mia shook her head, tears finally gathering in her eyes. That's exactly why he threatened me. He knew you'd fight back. He knew you'd go to war for us. And he said that if you even tried, he'd expose things in the company that would destroy you. I didn't know which threats were real and which were meant to scare me, but I wasn't willing to risk the lives of 2 unborn children. I couldn't let you get dragged into something dangerous because of me. Her voice broke completely then, and she covered her mouth with her hand to steady herself. For years he had pictured her leaving coldly, rationally, choosing a life without him. Instead, she had been running from nightmares while carrying the last pieces of him inside her. The realization struck Ethan with such force that he felt unsteady all over again. He approached her slowly, cautiously, as if she were made of something fragile and irreplaceable. Mia, he whispered, his voice soft but weighted with everything he felt, you shouldn't have had to face any of that alone. And you won't anymore. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time since she walked into his office, he saw something flicker there, not fear, not guilt, but the beginning of relief. And as the boys giggled quietly in the background, unaware of how their existence had just rewritten the truth between their parents, Ethan silently vowed that whatever darkness Mia had been running from was going to end, permanently. Ethan didn't sleep the night after Mia told him the truth. Long after she and the boys had fallen asleep in the guest rooms he insisted they take, he stood alone in his office with the city glittering far below, feeling the weight of every word she had spoken press against his ribs. The anger that burned in him was unlike anything he had ever felt, growing hotter with every minute he replayed her confession. The betrayal didn't come from Mia, it came from the one person he had trusted enough to bring into the core of his business and his life. Daniel had always been competitive, always hungry for more, but Ethan had never imagined that hunger turning into something poisonous. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces of the past began to rearrange themselves into a picture he should have seen long ago. Contracts that disappeared from his desk, meetings Daniel insisted on handling alone, investments that looked promising but crumbled at the last moment, all things Ethan had blamed on circumstance or stress. Now he saw the truth hidden beneath them, the same truth Mia had been forced to face alone. Daniel had been sabotaging him long before Mia disappeared. By sunrise, Ethan's anger had hardened into focus. He wasn't a man who sat still when someone threatened what he loved. He called in a private investigator he trusted from previous corporate disputes, a man named Carter Hale, who was blunt enough to intimidate people but sharp enough to see through lies. Carter listened carefully to everything Ethan told him, his expression shifting only slightly when he heard Mia's account. "If half of what she said is accurate," Carter muttered, jotting notes into a small leather notebook, "your brother is in deeper trouble than he realizes. But we'll need proof. Real proof. And we'll need to find out how far he's already gone." They worked through the morning gathering every file, contract, email trail, and financial footprint Daniel had ever touched. Ethan avoided telling Mia the details. She was already carrying the weight of 3 difficult years, and he wasn't going to add more. Instead, he spent the day watching her interact with the boys, noticing how often she looked over her shoulder out of habit, how she flinched at loud noises she hadn't expected, how her body still operated on survival mode even inside his secured penthouse. Seeing that only intensified his determination. By the end of the first week, Carter returned with enough evidence to make Ethan's stomach twist. Daniel had created shell companies linked to offshore accounts, diverting millions from Ethan's corporation. He forged signatures, manipulated investor trust, bribed 2 department heads, and even cut deals with competitors behind Ethan's back. But the most damning part came in the form of a series of encrypted messages Carter had managed to decode, messages outlining Daniel's plan to dismantle Ethan's leadership from the inside. Mia wasn't lying. She had been the leverage Daniel planned to use to force Ethan into stepping down. Daniel had even written that if Mia stayed, she and the children can be used as pressure points. Pressure points. Ethan felt sick reading those words. He didn't realize his hands were shaking until Mia gently touched his shoulder. She had entered the office without him noticing, her eyes instantly filled with concern when she saw the distress on his face. "Is it about Daniel?" she asked softly. Ethan wanted to shield her from the truth, but there was no point in pretending anymore. "It's worse than we thought," he admitted, lowering the documents so she couldn't see the harsh phrases written across them. "He planned everything with disturbing detail. But it's over now. We're shutting every door he tried to open." Once the evidence was solid and undeniable, Ethan moved quickly. He scheduled an emergency board meeting, presented the findings, and made sure every single accusation was backed by documentation. The room fell silent as he explained Daniel's involvement, the financial theft, the manipulation, and, finally, the threats he had made against Mia and the boys. The shock on the board members' faces slowly turned into fury, not toward Ethan, but toward the man who had tried to bring the entire company down for his own ambition. Within an hour, Daniel was stripped of every title, position, and privilege he held. The legal team filed charges, and the media caught wind of the scandal before noon. Daniel tried to fight back, denying everything, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, demanding answers. Ethan refused interviews, determined to keep Mia and the children as far from the chaos as possible. As the investigation escalated, Daniel was arrested for fraud, extortion, and embezzlement, forced into the spotlight he had once craved but now feared. His empire of manipulation collapsed in a matter of days, leaving him with nothing but consequences he had earned. For Ethan, the victory didn't feel satisfying, it felt necessary. Every step he took, every decision he made, was driven by the image of Mia holding their sons, terrified and alone. He had failed to protect her once, but he would never let that happen again. For the first time in years, Mia slept without checking the locks twice. The boys played freely in a home where no one would ever threaten them again. And Ethan stood by the window each night, looking at the city with a new understanding. The war Daniel had started was over. The danger was gone. And now, finally, the future Mia had been too afraid to imagine was beginning to take shape, one where she and the boys no longer had to hide, and where Ethan could start fighting not for revenge, but for the life he had almost lost forever. When the storm surrounding Daniel finally began to settle, the atmosphere in Ethan's penthouse shifted in a way that was almost too subtle to notice at first. The constant fear that had followed Mia for years no longer clung to her skin. The air around her felt lighter, though she didn't trust it yet, as if expecting danger to appear from behind every corner. For days she moved through the apartment quietly, cautious in her steps, as though the walls might collapse if she breathed too loudly. But slowly, little by little, something inside her began to loosen. It showed in the way her shoulders no longer sat so high, in the way she allowed herself to watch the boys play without scanning the room for exits, and in the way she finally started meeting Ethan's eyes without flinching. The evening after Daniel's arrest, the penthouse was quieter than usual. The boys had fallen asleep early after a long day filled with more laughter than Mia had thought possible. Aiden had insisted on showing Ethan the tower he built from magnetic tiles, and Lucas had climbed into Ethan's lap as if he had known him all his life. Watching them had stirred something deep inside Mia, a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. She tucked them into bed gently, brushing their hair from their foreheads before whispering good night. When she stepped out of their room, she found Ethan standing on the balcony, the city lights flickering below them like restless stars. He turned when he heard the door slide open, his expression softening instantly at the sight of her. He looked exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually, but there was something else beneath the exhaustion, a quiet determination that hadn't dimmed even after the battles of the past week. Mia stepped outside, hugging her arms around herself as the cool night air drifted over her skin. For a moment they simply stood there, side by side, the city humming beneath their feet. Ethan broke the silence first, though his voice was low, almost cautious. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing you. Losing them. Losing all of it without even knowing what I was losing." He shook his head, the confession wrestling its way out. "I don't know how you survived everything on your own." Mia let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it. "I didn't survive it well," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "There were days I couldn't breathe from the fear. Days I thought about turning back, about risking everything just so you wouldn't have to go through this alone. But every time I almost did, I remembered Daniel's voice and the way he looked at me." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself as if trying to erase the memory. "I wasn't just scared for myself. I was scared for the boys. They were the only thing that kept me going." Ethan took a step closer, slowly, as if giving her time to pull away if she needed to. "She didn't. You should never have had to face any of that," he said, and his voice carried a depth of sincerity that reached right into the parts of her that still felt shattered. "You were protecting my family while I had no idea they even existed. You did it alone. Mia." He hesitated, searching her face. "I don't think I can ever thank you enough for that." She gave him a small, sad smile. "I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I love them. Because I loved you." Her voice softened even more, almost fading into the hum of the city. "And because losing you would have destroyed me just as much as losing them." The confession hit him harder than he expected. He drew a slow breath, taking in the vulnerability in her posture, the way her eyes glistened in the dim light. He realized then that despite the years apart, despite everything that had happened, she still stood before him with a heart that carried traces of their past. She hadn't closed the door completely, not even after everything she had endured. Without thinking, he reached out and gently touched her arm. She froze for a moment, startled, but she didn't move away. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "I never stopped loving you," he said, and the truth of it rang clear in every word. "Not for one day. Not even when I thought you'd walked out because you didn't care. Even then, I couldn't make myself believe it." Mia's breath caught. The wind lifted a strand of hair from her cheek, and Ethan, almost without thinking, brushed it back with a tenderness that made her eyes widen. His hand lingered for a second longer than necessary, and for the first time in years she didn't flinch, didn't step away, didn't retreat into the protective shell she had learned to carry. Instead, she leaned slightly into the warmth of his touch, her eyes searching his as though trying to confirm he was real. "I'm still scared," she confessed quietly. "Everything happened so fast. I don't know how to go back to being the person I was. I don't even know who that person is anymore." "You don't have to be her," Ethan replied. "You don't owe the past anything. You don't have to pretend this didn't break you. You don't have to pretend it didn't break me too." He moved a little closer, his voice softening. "We don't have to fix everything at once. We just start from where we are. One step at a time. Together." Her eyes filled, not with fear but with something gentler, hope, fragile and hesitant but unmistakably there. She let out a breath that seemed to lift years of weight from her chest and nodded slowly. "Together," she repeated, the word feeling new and familiar all at once. In the quiet glow of the city lights, with the wind brushing against them and the boys sleeping peacefully inside, Mia allowed herself to lean her head against Ethan's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't try to push the moment faster than she was ready for. He simply wrapped an arm around her, holding her close with a certainty she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since she had run, Mia felt safe. Not because she was hidden, not because she was guarded, but because she wasn't alone anymore. And as Ethan held her in the soft darkness, he knew that whatever scars the past had left behind, the future, finally, belonged to all of them. Life inside the penthouse began to take on a new rhythm, one that was unfamiliar to Ethan but quickly became something he cherished in ways he never expected. The once silent hallways, where the only sounds had been clicking keyboards, distant phone calls, and the low hum of the city, now echoed with tiny footsteps, bursts of laughter, and the chaotic symphony of 2 3-year-old boys discovering every corner of their new world. Aiden and Lucas explored the place as if it were a kingdom built for them, claiming every cushion, every blanket, every shadowed corner as part of their territory. Ethan often found himself pausing in the middle of his work just to watch them, two small beings who had existed for years without his knowledge, yet whose presence now felt essential, as if they had been missing pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was building. Each day brought something new for him to learn. He discovered that Aiden was the bolder one, always the first to climb onto a chair he wasn't supposed to or attempt to build a tower taller than himself. Lucas, on the other hand, was quieter, more deliberate, studying everything before joining in. When Aiden ran too fast and tripped, Lucas was the first to kneel beside him, patting his back with a tiny hand and whispering encouragements. Ethan saw reflections of himself in both boys. Aiden's recklessness mirrored his younger years, and Lucas's thoughtful caution echoed the man he had become. Mia watched these moments with a kind of quiet amazement, her eyes softening as if she were seeing Ethan for the first time all over again. During the years they had been apart, she had carried the weight of parenting alone, learning how to soothe nightmares, fix bruises, distract tantrums, and celebrate milestones with no one to share them with. To see Ethan now, kneeling on the carpet helping Aiden line up toy trains or letting Lucas tuck his hand into Ethan's shirt for reassurance, stirred emotions in her that she hadn't let herself feel for a long time. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, something almost like coming home to a place she wasn't sure still existed. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the wide windows and spilled across the living room floor, Ethan sat cross-legged on the carpet while the boys surrounded him with magnetic blocks. They had decided, without discussion, that he was to help them build the biggest house ever, which in their minds meant a chaotic, impossible structure that defied every rule of physics. Ethan tried to guide them, offering suggestions on balance and support, but Aiden kept grabbing pieces and placing them wherever he liked while Lucas tried to stabilize the leaning towers with intense concentration. Mia leaned against the doorframe, smiling as she watched the three of them work together in a harmony that only children could create. Ethan looked up at her once, his expression warm and unmistakably grateful, as though building that crooked little house with them meant more than any corporate achievement he had ever celebrated. He began adjusting his work schedule, moving meetings, declining events, and delegating responsibilities he had once refused to relinquish. His employees noticed the shift in him, a softer edge in his voice, a patience he hadn't possessed before, and a groundedness that came from something far more meaningful than success. Instead of staying at the office until midnight, he returned home in time for dinner, eager to hear the boys tell stories that made no sense but made them giggle uncontrollably. He learned how to cut sandwiches into dinosaur shapes, how to fix a toy fire truck that refused to roll, and how to read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that had the boys squealing with laughter. Mia found herself adjusting as well. She was no longer navigating motherhood alone, no longer carrying fear on her shoulders without relief. She started sleeping better, eating better, letting the tension unwind from her body day by day. Still, she kept a protective distance at times, as if reminding herself not to rely too heavily on the fragile hope forming between her and Ethan. She stepped carefully, aware that whatever happened next needed to be built slowly and honestly. Ethan respected that unspoken need. He never pushed, never demanded more than she could offer, and always made sure she knew she had a place in the home without feeling trapped by it. As the weeks passed, the bond between Ethan and the boys grew stronger until it felt as natural as breathing. They began calling for him when they woke from naps or when they needed help. They climbed into his lap without hesitation, tugged at his sleeve to get his attention, and showed him their scribbled drawings as if his approval were the most important thing in the world. He wasn't just stepping into fatherhood, he was embracing it wholeheartedly, discovering a part of himself he didn't know he was capable of being. Mia often caught him in quiet moments, staring at the boys with a mix of awe and regret, as if still mourning the time he had missed but grateful for the time he had now. One evening, after the boys had finally fallen asleep, Mia walked into the living room to find Ethan sitting on the couch with a tiny blue bracelet made of colorful rubber bands looped around his wrist. Aiden had insisted he wear it forever, and Ethan had promised he would. Mia sat beside him, her gaze lingering on the bracelet before drifting up to his face. The silence between them was gentle, comfortable, filled with understanding rather than tension. Ethan turned toward her, his expression soft, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen since long before she left, love, steady and patient, waiting for her to be ready. The realization that they were slowly becoming a family again settled over her like warm sunlight. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for the first time in years, Mia allowed herself to believe that maybe the pieces of her life could be put back together into something stronger than what had existed before. Ethan felt the same. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by the remnants of toys and the lingering laughter of two little boys, he understood that the future he wanted more than anything was not measured in wealth or power. It was measured in moments like these, moments filled with the people he loved more fiercely than he ever expected. And as the night deepened around them, neither of them said a word, but both understood something important. The life they were beginning to build wasn't just a second chance, it was the one they had been meant to have all along. Ethan had always believed that grand gestures belonged in movies or in the glossy pages of magazines, the kind of staged moments that never truly reflected real life. But as the weeks passed and the quiet stability of their newfound family settled deeper into his heart, he found himself wanting to create something meaningful, something that would remind Mia of everything they had survived and everything they were building. He waited patiently, allowing her time to heal, time to feel safe, time to trust both him and the life slowly forming around them. He noticed the small shifts, how she laughed more freely now, how she no longer touched the lock on the front door twice before bed, how she let herself sit close to him on the couch without needing to pull away. She was still cautious, still tender in the places that had been wounded for too long, but she was opening up, letting hope in one breath at a time. The boys thrived in the warmth that now filled the penthouse. Aiden grew bolder with every passing day, running through the hallways with boundless energy, while Lucas became more talkative, asking questions about everything he saw. There was a joy in them that had always been there but was now brighter, fuller, as if the absence of fear made room for new pieces of their personalities to bloom. Ethan cherished it all. He cherished the mornings when they barreled into his bed demanding pancakes, the evenings when they fell asleep against him during story time, the simple moments when they reached for his hand without hesitation. Each of those moments etched themselves into his heart, becoming memories he knew he would cling to for the rest of his life. Mia often watched him with a softness in her eyes that told him she saw the same thing he did, a future that was no longer shadowed by what had once chased her into hiding. Still, Ethan wanted to give her something more, something that wasn't just about the past they had endured, but the future he hoped they could claim. He spent days planning it quietly, enlisting help where necessary, rearranging schedules, ensuring everything would unfold exactly as he imagined. He didn't want extravagance for its own sake. He wanted sincerity, something that reflected not the wealth he had accumulated, but the love he felt for her, a love that had survived distance, silence, and fear. On the anniversary of the night he had first told her he loved her, long before life had twisted into something darker, he asked her to meet him downstairs after dinner. The boys were already asleep, tired from an afternoon at the Children's Museum. Mia descended the private elevator with a curious expression, wearing a soft sweater and jeans, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. When the doors slid open, she paused. Ethan stood waiting for her beside a black car, the city lights reflecting off its surface. He wore no suit, no tie, just a simple dark shirt and a look in his eyes that made her heart stutter. He didn't explain where they were going, simply took her hand and opened the door for her. She settled into the seat, her curiosity growing as they drove through the city. The streets were alive with people, lights, and distant music, but inside the car everything felt quiet, intimate, wrapped in an anticipation she didn't fully understand. When they finally arrived, Mia recognized the place instantly, the park where Ethan had first confessed his feelings years ago, when their lives had been simpler and their futures wide open. He led her along the path lined with lanterns he'd arranged earlier, their warm glow guiding them toward a clearing. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming night flowers. When they stepped into the open space, Mia stopped in her tracks. Thousands of tiny lights were strung between the trees above them, forming a soft canopy that shimmered like stars. At the center of it all stood a small wooden table with 2 candles flickering gently in the breeze. She looked around with wide eyes, disbelief softening her features. "Ethan, what is all this?" He stepped in front of her, gently taking both of her hands in his. His gaze was steady, filled with emotion he didn't bother hiding. "It's everything I should have done a long time ago," he said. "It's everything I want to do for as long as you'll let me. I've spent months watching you heal and helping the boys settle, but there's one thing I haven't told you enough." He took a breath, his thumbs brushing lightly against her hands. "I love you, Mia. I loved you before everything went wrong, I loved you through every day you were gone, and I love you now with a certainty I didn't know I was capable of." Her breath caught, tears already gathering at the corners of her eyes. She tried to speak, but he gently shook his head, his voice softening even further. "Let me finish," he murmured. Then he slowly dropped to one knee, not the stunned collapse from the day she returned, but a deliberate, meaningful movement that carried the weight of everything he felt. The lights above them shimmered against his dark hair as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring that glowed under the lantern light, elegant and understated, chosen with care rather than extravagance. Mia pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes widening with emotion. Ethan looked up at her, his expression open, vulnerable, hopeful. "Mia Brown," he said softly, "you gave me a family without even knowing it. You protected our sons when I couldn't. You carried a burden you should never have had to face alone. And now I want to spend the rest of my life giving you every safety, every joy, and every moment of peace you deserved from the beginning. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because her heart was swelling too quickly for words to form. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, breath hitching. Yes, she finally whispered, her voice breaking. Yes, Ethan. Of course I will. He rose to his feet, relief and joy flashing across his face as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Mia threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder, and he held her tightly, as if anchoring them both in a moment neither would ever forget. The lights above them shimmered like constellations as the city hummed around them, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding beneath the trees. And when they finally pulled apart, smiling through tears, the first small firework burst softly in the sky overhead. Despite their surprise, neither of them looked away. They stood hand in hand, watching colors bloom above them, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. The future, bright and unbroken, stretched before them like the lights that illuminated the park. For the first time in years, Mia felt completely free. And Ethan, holding her hand with the certainty of a man who had finally found what he had been searching for, knew that this love, this family, this moment, was the greatest victory of his life.